Chapter 7. On Board the Rangoon. The Rangoon was a good ship. It was just as fast as the Mongolia, though it was not as comfortable. Phileas Fogg wanted to make the journey as pleasant for Mrs. Aouda as he could. She understood this and did not complain. She began to like him and wondered why he was always polite and never showed any emotion. Passepartout explained the bet to her. He told her that his master was sometimes more like a machine than a man. She thought Phileas Fogg was unusual and interesting. She looked at him with her beautiful eyes, but he did not seem to notice. The first part of this journey went well. Soon they could see the island of Great Andaman, with its 2,400-foot-high mountain. The ship stayed close to the shore and quickly reached the Strait of Malacca, which led to the China Sea. Mr. Fix, meanwhile, was also on the Rangoon. He had asked the police at Calcutta to send the warrant to Hong Kong when it arrived. Now he was hiding in his cabin. He hoped that Passepartout would not see him. He had to arrest Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong. It would be very difficult to arrest him if he went on to America, because then he would no longer be on British territory. I must delay him in Hong Kong, he told himself. He thought about telling Passepartout that his master was a thief. This would be a big risk. He would only do that if there was no other way to stop Phileas Fogg from leaving Hong Kong. Who is that beautiful young woman? He wondered. Perhaps she was helping him, or perhaps Phileas Fogg had kidnapped her. He decided to send a telegraph from Singapore to China to tell the police that Fogg was on his way. He decided that he should talk to Passepartout again and see what he could find out from him. He left his cabin and soon found Passepartout, who was very surprised to see him again. They were soon talking like old friends, and it wasn't long before Passepartout told Mr. Fix about Mrs. Aouda. "We rescued her in India, and we are taking her to Hong Kong to be with her relatives," he said. Passepartout and Mr. Fix met each other often after that. Mr. Fogg played whist with some friends he had found on the ship and often sat with Mrs. Aouda. Passepartout wondered why Mr. Fix was on the same ship as them again. Suddenly, he had an idea. He decided that Mr. Fix was working for the members of the Reform Club. He was checking that Phileas Fogg really did go around the world. He was a spy. Passepartout was angry. They should trust his master instead of paying a spy to watch him. He did not tell Mr. Fix what he thought, but decided that he would get his revenge on him later. On the 30th of October, the Rangoon entered the Strait of Malacca, which separates the Malay Peninsula from the island of Sumatra. The next day, it stopped at Singapore to take on more coal. It was about half a day ahead of schedule. Phileas Fogg went ashore with Mrs. Aouda, secretly followed by Mr. Fix. Passepartout did his usual shopping. They all came back to the Rangoon a few hours later, and it soon set off toward Hong Kong, which was 1,300 miles away. Phileas Fogg had 6 days to get there. That was when a ship was leaving for Yokohama, in Japan. There were a lot of passengers on the Rangoon for this part of the journey. The weather was bad and the sea was rough. Luckily, the wind was blowing from the south, which helped the steamship to go faster. Sometimes the sea was so rough that the ship had to slow down or find shelter near the land. Passepartout was impatient, but nothing seemed to worry Phileas Fogg. "Are you really in a hurry to get to Hong Kong?" Mr. Fix asked Passepartout one day. "Yes, a terrible hurry. My master must catch the ship that goes to Yokohama." "Do you really believe this story of the bet to go around the world in 80 days? "Yes, of course. Don't you?" "No, I don't believe it," said the police officer. "You are a real jester," said Passepartout. This worried Mr. Fix. Why had Passepartout called him a jester? "Are you stopping in Hong Kong, or are you coming with us to Yokohama and America?" asked Passepartout, smiling. "I'm not sure," replied Mr. Fix, looking carefully at his friend. "Why not? I'm sure you are not paying for your trip," laughed Passepartout. Mr. Fix went to his cabin. Why had Passepartout laughed at him? He was sure that Passepartout had guessed that he was a police officer. Had he told his master? Mr. Fix was not sure what to do. Passepartout meanwhile could see that Mrs. Aouda was falling in love with his master. Phileas Fogg, however, did not seem to notice. The last few days of the trip to Hong Kong were very bad. The weather was terrible, and a strong wind blew from the north. This slowed down the steamship. It rolled around on the high waves, and most of the passengers felt sick. During the 3rd and 4th of November, there was a bad storm, and the Rangoon had to take shelter for half a day. It could not make any progress. It seemed certain that the ship would arrive late in Hong Kong. If the storm did not stop soon, the ship might be 20 hours late. Then Phileas Fogg would miss the ship to Yokohama. However, the traveler remained calm. He never seemed to worry about anything. Mr. Fix, however, was very happy about the storm. It was exactly what he wanted. Any delay was welcome because it would make Phileas Fogg stay in Hong Kong until there was another ship going to Yokohama. He felt sick, but he didn't care. He was happy. Chapter 8. Mr. Fix and Passepartout have a drink together. The storm made Mr. Fix happy because he wanted Phileas Fogg to be delayed in Hong Kong. Passepartout, however, was not happy at all. He was very worried. Everything was going wrong now, and his master might lose his bet. He stayed on the decks and did everything he could to help the ship's crew. He asked the captain and the other officers a lot of questions about the weather, but they just laughed at him for being so worried. They could not tell him how long the storm would last. Like all storms, however, it did end. It was now the 4th of November, and the wind swung around and helped the ship go faster. But it was not possible to make up the time that was lost. The ship to Yokohama left Hong Kong on the 5th of November, but the Rangoon would not arrive until the 6th. At 6 o'clock that morning, the pilot came on board the ship to steer it into the harbor. Passepartout wanted to ask the pilot if the ship for Yokohama had already left, but he did not dare. He was afraid of the answer he might hear. Mr. Fogg, however, was not afraid. "Do you know when the next ship goes to Yokohama?" he asked the pilot. "Tomorrow morning at high tide." "Which ship is it?" "The Carnatic." "But wasn't it going to depart today?" "Yes, that's right," agreed the pilot. "However, it needed some repairs, so the departure has been delayed until tomorrow." "Thank you," said Phileas Fogg and returned to his cabin. Passepartout heard this conversation and was delighted. They were very lucky. Because the Carnatic needed repairs, they would still be able to go to Yokohama on it. They would be late, but they would be able to make up the time. The next ship was not due to leave for another 8 days. That would have made it impossible for Phileas Fogg to complete his journey in 80 days. The Rangoon arrived at 1 o'clock that afternoon, and the passengers went ashore. Phileas Fogg took Mrs. Aouda to the best hotel and booked a room for her. He went to the stock exchange to search for her relative. He soon discovered that the rich relative had left Hong Kong 2 years ago and was living in Europe. He returned to the hotel and told Mrs. Aouda his news. "What should I do?" she asked. "Come to London," he replied. "You are welcome to come with us." He told Passepartout to book an extra cabin on the Carnatic. Passepartout was delighted and left immediately. Hong Kong was only a small island and had been a British territory for about 30 years. It had a lot of buildings that looked English. Passepartout looked at them as he walked to Victoria Harbour. It was like walking through Calcutta, Bombay, or Singapore. As he came closer to the Carnatic, he saw Mr. Fix walking up and down looking annoyed. "Good," thought Passepartout. "It is not going well for the members of the Reform Club." He went up to his friend smiling. Mr. Fix was annoyed because the warrant had not arrived. Of course, Passepartout knew nothing about that. "Are you coming to America with us?" he asked. "Yes," replied Mr. Fix, with his teeth together. Passepartout laughed. "I knew you would. Come and book a cabin with me." The two men went into the office and booked their cabins. The clerk told them that the repairs had been finished and that the Carnatic would depart that evening at 8 o'clock. "Good," said Passepartout. "My master will be very happy. I'll go and tell him." At that moment, Mr. Fix decided to act. He would tell Passepartout everything. It was perhaps the only way to keep Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong for a few more days. He invited his friend to have a drink in a hotel near the harbor. They went into the hotel and soon realized that they had chosen a bad place. There were a lot of men sitting around and smoking opium. Most of the people who were addicted to this drug died within 5 years. Mr. Fix bought some wine and talked about the trip to America as they drank it. Passepartout got up to go and tell his master that the ship was leaving that evening, but Mr. Fix held him back. "I have something important to tell you," he said. "We can talk about it tomorrow," said Passepartout. "We don't have time now." "It's about your master." Passepartout sat down again. "Have you guessed who I am?" asked Mr. Fix. "Of course, but let me tell you that those gentlemen at the club are wasting their money." Mr. Fix did not understand this, but offered him £500 to help him keep Phileas Fogg in Hong Kong for a few days. Passepartout was very angry. It is bad enough to spy on him. Now they want to try and stop him? My master is a good man, but his partners at the Reform Club are bad. They are supposed to be his friends. "I am not a spy for the members of the Reform Club," explained Mr. Fix. "I am a police officer." He showed Passepartout his badge. Passepartout was so surprised that he could not speak. Mr. Fix explained that Phileas Fogg was a thief who had stolen £55,000 from the Bank of England. Of course, Passepartout would not believe him. "My master is the most honest man in the world." "How do you know? You only began to work for him the day you started your journey. He left London with a large sum of money." Passepartout was confused, but he still refused to believe it or to help Mr. Fix. "You won't help me?" "No." "Then let's forget everything I said. Have another drink." They had another drink, but Mr. Fix put some opium in Passepartout's glass, and he fainted onto the floor. Mr. Fix left him there and walked out of the hotel. Good, he thought. Now Phileas Fogg will not find out that the Carnatic is leaving tonight, and he will have to wait for the next ship. That meant there would be 8 days for the warrant to arrive.